Hello, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane. In today's quilting video tutorial, I'm going to share with you how to make a triangle and a square quilt block, which is also known as a Tri-Rec Quilt Block. The triangle and a square quilt block is a traditional favorite. It's a really fun, more advanced technique if you want to play with triangles after you've already mastered the classic half square triangle. So if you're ready for some fun modern triangle quilt blocks, you're gonna love this video. This video will teach you how to make the Tri-Rec Quilt Block using rulers. But if you want to see it using AccuQuilt, I have a video up about that as well. Check it out right here. Before I dive into what is a Tri-Rec Quilt Block, let me tell you what it is not. A Tri-Rec Quilt Block is not a 60-degree equilateral triangle. It's actually just less than 60 degrees, and it's an isosceles triangle, which means that the two sides of the triangle are the same length, but the base is not the same length as the sides. So you'll see in these quilt blocks that we're using today, the base is just slightly shorter than the sides that put the triangle perfectly inside of a square with some seam allowance. I will be using rulers for this tutorial, and I want to share with you my favorite rulers for this quilt block. I'll put a link in the description below for you. I'm actually going to share with you two different rulers sets that you can use. The first one is a set from Planted Seed Designs. This is a really fun set that actually includes the triangle as well as the background piece, which goes on the sides of the triangle. It's kind of hard to see here, but you'll see in a minute. It'll make a lot more sense. So this is a set, and at the time of filming, I actually have some in my shop that you can purchase or anywhere that you can find them online. Again, this is the Triangle and a Square by Planted Seed Designs. This makes a Tri-Rec block up to 6.5 inches. If you want something bigger, there's another option. If you wanted to make a bigger quilt block, you can use the Creative Grids set. So the Creative Grid set is actually two pieces that you purchase separately that work together, and I'll put links to both of them below. The first piece is the center triangle, and as I mentioned, this angle up here is less than 60 degrees, so it's not the same as the 60-degree triangle, and this ruler goes to 9.5 inches. So you can make a very big block with this, and then it has a piece that goes with it for the sides. So this is a really great option as well if you want some bigger blocks. Creative Grids makes a really fantastic product with some grippies on the back. It's a little bit of an investment, but definitely worth it. Once you have your rulers, the next step is to prepare your fabric. If you've worked with wovens or quilting cottons before, then you know that the bias edge is the stretchy edge, and of course making triangles of any kind requires some sewing on a bias or pressing with the bias, and we don't want that fabric to stretch because it'll distort our blocks. So the first thing I do when making Tri-Recs, triangle and a square blocks, is prep my fabric using Best Press. If you have a different starch or starch alternative that you prefer to use that. But if you've never tried Best Press before, I highly recommend it. I put it in a spray bottle and I just treat my fabric with it while I'm ironing. So let me go heat up my iron and let's start with some Best Press. So first things first, I do this with nearly every quilting project. I prep my fabrics. I have a nice hot iron, and then I have Best Press in my spray bottle. And I love this misting spray bottle, but some people don't. So find a bottle that works for you, or sometimes Best Press is actually sold in a squirt bottle. So that works great too. So for this, I just grabbed some scraps from my stash from a previous quilt. And I'm doing a light color with a print and then a darker color for some contrast. And I'll just spritz on the fabric with the Best Press. And then let it soak in a little bit. If you find that the Best Press is beading on the fabric and not soaking in, you can just fold the fabric over and press it down, and that normally makes it soak in. You can actually see a lot of the wrinkles are already coming out just with the liquid, but I'm gonna bring my nice hot iron on it. We're not trying to like iron it like real fast, but just kind of press it down, let the heat do the work for you so it doesn't distort the fabric. And then you just hold the iron on until it's dry. And then we'll repeat that same process with any other fabrics. So because this block is going to use two fabrics, I'll do it to both. Once your fabrics are prepped, we are ready to start cutting. All right, you'll see I have here my rulers from Planted Seed Designs and then my fabrics that I'm gonna be using. For this block, I'm gonna use this light blue as the background and then this darker blue for the actual triangle. So you'll see here, I have the triangle and then the fabric that I'm gonna be using. And because this fabric does have a directional print, I'm going to line it up so that the triangle has that clamshell across. So you'll see that for the triangle block, it shows how big the triangle is going to be. I'm actually gonna do this one at a 5-inch triangle in a square. So I've got here my rotary cutter as well as just a straight edge ruler so that I can trim off this little zigzag piece. So we'll get a nice flat edge for the bottom, and then I'll bring the triangle up here and cut it right at 5 inches. I will say if you are going to cut multiple triangles, you could cut a width of fabric and then cut from the 5-inch line. And then another point is that you don't want the base of the triangle to be on the bias. You want the base of the triangle to be on grain, and then the two sides will be on the bias. So for that, I'm just gonna keep it like right here and then trim. So you'll see when I pull this away that we have a perfect center triangle that is 5 inches, and then we're gonna do it with this light blue as the background. So you'll see I already have a straight edge here, and I'm actually gonna do what I mentioned earlier about cutting a width of fabric strip, and then we're gonna do this at 5 inches as well. You'll see that this is 5 inches, this is 5 inches, that's gonna work out really well. So set aside our scraps. So now we're gonna use this ruler. But one thing I wanna point out is that this fabric has a right and a wrong side to it. So we wanna make sure that we're cutting both left and right side triangles. So in order to do that, I'm actually gonna fold the fabric, and we're gonna start by cutting this direction. So now you'll see that we have cut out the middle center triangle, and then we have a left side and a right side to make it into a square. We'll stitch on both sides of the triangle to make a quilt block. So next thing we want to do is head over to our sewing machine. Before we start sewing our Tri-Rec block together, I have a few tips I want to share with you. The first thing is to make sure that you're using a nice sharp needle on your machine. I believe I have a size 75 needle, or maybe an 80. And then of course cotton thread is my preference. I'm using 50 weight today for this piecing. And then I like to use the straight stitch needle plate. So my machine actually has two different plates that go on it. This one with a wide needle hole, and then this one with a much smaller needle hole. So I'm going to use the one with the smaller needle hole that keeps the pieces of my block, especially the tip that we start sewing with, it keeps it from getting sucked into the machine. If you don't have an extra option for a straight stitch needle plate, then you might want another trick to use, and that's where I find leaders and enders to be super useful. So I'm gonna use one of these just little scraps of fabric. It literally is just a scrap of fabric that I sew on. You'll see I use this one quite a bit. And these little scraps of fabric, I'll stitch on them before I start sewing my piece, and that keeps the threads up and tucked away so that they don't get sucked into the machine and don't get the little corners of our piece sucked into the machine either. So leaders and enders are a beautiful thing. So finally, you can use pins to pin your pieces in place. I don't normally use pins if I'm just sewing two pieces together that don't have any seams to match up. But if you're a beginner, then pins can be really useful, and I definitely recommend starting with them. So for this one, we're going to flip right sides together for our triangle. The right side of your background over the center triangle, and line it up so that there is a 1/4 inch tip of the background piece at the front end, and then you'll see a 1/4 inch of your center triangle at the back end. And that'll make sure that your seam gets lined up nice and perfectly. So before we start sewing on that, I will stitch on my leader. And I'm just using a nice straight stitch. My stitch width is 2.5, but use what you like on your machine. So now we have our center triangle and our right side ready to be stitched together. And you'll see there is a little corner here. The base of our triangle meets with the edge of our side. So now we'll go ahead and stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you get to the end, go ahead and stitch on another ender. Grab your scissors and trim your block free. And now you'll see that ender from this piece will be the leader for our next seam. And you'll see we have a pretty straight 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when we pull this up, you'll see we have some seam allowance here at the base of the triangle as well. So the next thing that we're going to do is use a hot iron and press this seam open. You could press to the side if you wanted to, but pressing it open will give you the best results for a nice flat point later on. All right, now we have our unit here, the center triangle and the right side. So now the last thing we need to do is attach the left side. So now that we have a little tip here at the top, we can use that to line up with the tip of our left side. So that's going to be our little 1/4 inch extra. And then the bottom should have a little 1/4 inch triangle of the center triangle. And we're going to go ahead and stitch again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now you'll see here we have our seam, and then we can go ahead and press this one as well. So now you'll see that we have a nice perfect Tri-Rec Quilt Block, triangle in a square. And from here, one of my favorite things about Tri-Recs versus half square triangles is that I find that you don't actually need to trim them at all. Of course, there are some little dog ears that you can trim off if you choose to, and I'll show you how to do that. But I will show you with this ruler. It is pretty exact already. It should be a 5-inch square, and that's what we're seeing. So what I'm gonna do is just trim off the dog ears so that it's nice and flat. And then we're ready to use this block in our next quilt. One thing I will say as you're trimming is to pay close attention to your seam allowance down here at the bottom. It should look like it's not quite perfect, because when you get ready to sew, you'll see here, we want that 1/4 inch in on both sides to be where that seam is. And that's just how easy it is to make a perfect triangle in a square quilt block. I hope you found this quilting tutorial helpful and that you now feel confident enough to try out your own Tri-Rec quilt block. I would like to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also check out homemadeemilyjane.com for lots more quilting tips, tricks, and inspiration. Happy sewing!